Joas was born in a dark time, when Judah was plunged into betrayal and fear. Imagine the scene. The palace filled with whispers, doors slamming hurriedly, and in the corridors, a secret worth a life. Joash was just a baby when everything collapsed around him. His grandmother, Queen Athaliah, a cold and power-hungry woman, seized the throne by force after the death of King Ahaziah, Joash's father. But to ensure that no one threatened her reign, she did something unthinkable. She ordered the killing of all the royal descendants. It seemed like the end of the line for the house of David. But then came a breathtaking twist. Jehosheba, sister of the late king, couldn't bear to see that innocent baby condemned to death. She and her husband, the priest Jehoiada, risked everything. They hid Joash in a hurry and took him to the only place where Athaliah would never dare to look, the temple of the Lord. There, within sacred walls and far from the eyes of those hungry for power, Joash grew up in hiding for 6 whole years. A boy raised not in luxury, but surrounded by the presence of God, while outside, the people lived under the weight of a cruel government. Subscribe to the channel for more exciting Bible stories and turn on notifications so you don't miss any videos. If this content touches your heart and you want to support us, feel free to click on the Thanks a Lot button. All help is welcome and makes a big difference. Now just think about the contrast. While Athaliah reigned mercilessly, believing she had eliminated all her rivals, the true heir was there, learning and being prepared in silence. No one imagined that this shy little boy, who knew little of the world beyond the gates of the temple, held the key to the future of Judah. With each passing year, the tension increased, like a rope being stretched to its limit. And then, when Joash turned 7, something extraordinary began to happen. The time to hide was over. Jehoiada, that wise and fearless priest who cared for the boy like a true father, knew that the moment of truth had come. And so, with plans made in silence and great courage in his heart, he engineered one of the most incredible turnarounds in the history of Judah. On an ordinary morning, the temple began to fill with guards and leaders who had been secretly summoned. They were all there for one reason: to protect Joash and restore the royal line. The atmosphere was tense. Every step echoed in the stone corridors, and the muffled sound of weapons being handed to the soldiers mixed anxiety and hope. Until, in the midst of all that suspense, Jehoiada brought Joash into view. A frail boy with big eyes, looking around as if still trying to understand the weight of that moment. That's when the magic happened. Jehoiada placed the crown on Joash's head and anointed the boy king right there in front of a shocked crowd. Trumpets blared loudly, breaking the silence and tearing through the sky, while the people shouted, "Long live the king!" It was as if a cry of relief, held back for years, could finally escape. And Athaliah, when she heard the noise, she ran to the temple, tearing her clothes and shouting, "Treason! Treason!" But it was too late. The tide had turned, and the people, seized by a courage not seen in a long time, mercilessly removed her from power. And there stood Joash, the boy king, surrounded by applause and eyes full of hope. Joash, now crowned and seated on the throne, was just a boy, but a boy with an entire kingdom on his shoulders. And that is where, once again, the figure of Jehoiada comes in. This man was not just a priest, he was a true pillar for Judah and, above all, for Joash. He knew that ruling was not just about wearing a beautiful crown and listening to applause. It required vision, firmness, and above all, faith. Jehoiada, like a patient teacher, took Joash by the hand and began to mold him little by little to be more than just a figurehead king. The days that followed were intense. Joash accompanied his mentor to meetings, difficult decisions, and above all, moments of prayer. It was as if he were learning to see the kingdom with new eyes, seeing not only what was before him, but also what no one else could see, the soul of the nation. It didn't take long for changes to begin. One by one, the altars dedicated to false gods were destroyed. The people, who had previously walked with their heads bowed and lost, began to feel that something new was emerging. It was as if a fresh breeze was sweeping through the streets and hearts, bringing new hope. Joash grew not only in age, but also in understanding. And with Jehoiada always nearby, he became increasingly established as a principled king. But there was a shadow looming. For as much as Judah was beginning to breathe new air, there was still something that needed to be done. The temple, that sacred place that had been a refuge for Joash when he was just a baby, was in ruins. And a king who wanted to restore the faith of the people could not ignore this for long. It didn't take long for Joash to realize that even though he was cleansing the kingdom of idolatry, there was an open wound that could no longer be ignored. The temple of the Lord, the very place where he had been hidden and saved when he was just a helpless baby, was falling apart. Cracked walls, broken doors, the sound of wind blowing through wide cracks. A sad picture of abandonment. And it wasn't just a structural problem. It was a symbol of the people's faith, worn down and forgotten over years of neglect. Joash, now a determined young man, decided it was time to act. He called the priests and leaders and announced a bold plan to restore the temple, returning it to the greatness and respect it deserved. But raising the funds was not easy. At first, the priests did not take it seriously, stalling and delaying action. But Joash, who had already learned to be firm, stood his ground. He had a large chest made with a hole in the lid and placed it at the entrance to the temple. Anyone who passed by could contribute. It wasn't long before coins began to fall, tinkling like an echo of faith being rekindled. The noise of tools filled Jerusalem once again. Hammers, saws, voices mixed in a single rhythm, the rhythm of reconstruction. Every piece of wood, every stone replaced, seemed to shout that the people were slowly finding their way back to God. It was a powerful image. Where there had been ruin, now there was beauty. Where there had been silence, now there was hope. But like every story, this one also had an unexpected turning point. With every hammer blow that echoed off the walls of the temple, it seemed that Judah was gaining new life. The people were excited. Joash was strong on the throne, and everything indicated that this phase would be remembered as a time of restoration. But there was a key piece in this whole mechanism: Jehoiada. He was not only Joash's spiritual mentor, he was also the invisible foundation that sustained the kingdom behind the scenes. And it was precisely when this pillar fell that the cracks began to appear. Jehoiada died at a ripe old age, after years of serving with courage and wisdom. The people honored him with a burial fit for kings, even though he had never worn a crown. But for Joas, that loss was much deeper. It was as if, suddenly, the firm voice that had always guided him had fallen silent, and the path ahead was covered by a heavy fog. Without Jehoiada around, Joash found himself surrounded by other advisors. Only these were not nearly as good as Jehoiada. They were flatterers, men who told the king what he wanted to hear, not what he needed to hear. And Joash, vulnerable and perhaps still feeling the weight of loss, began to listen to these new voices. What had once seemed like a solid reign began to show signs of weakness. The faith that had been rebuilt with so much effort was now treated with carelessness. It was as if the king who had once led with such conviction was now adrift, unaware of the abyss that was slowly opening up before him. Without Jehoiada to hold the reins, Joash began to change, and not for the better. The same advisors who had previously flattered him now showed their true intentions. Little by little, they pushed the king away from everything that had been built with so much sweat and faith, and Joash, already far from the steadfastness he once had, let himself be carried away. The streets of Jerusalem, which had once seen pagan altars being torn down, began to see those same altars returning, like ancient ghosts that had never really gone away. The people, who still remembered the glory of the early years of the reign, now looked around and saw images of idols being erected once again. It was a hard blow to those who had believed in a new beginning. The temple, newly renovated, remained standing on the outside, but on the inside, wrong practices and idolatry undermined the spirit of the nation. It was as if everything that had been achieved was slowly falling apart, like sand slipping through one's fingers. Joash, who had once been a symbol of hope, now seemed blind to what was happening right before his eyes, and even with some trying to warn him, he closed himself off more and more in pride and vanity. The people's trust in him began to crack, and that bitter feeling of déjà vu hung in the air. Once again, Judah was straying from the right path. In the midst of this scenario, where everything seemed to be falling apart, a voice cut through the silence like a sharp sword. It was Zechariah, son of Jehoiada. He carried not only the blood of the high priest, but also the same courage his father had shown years before. Zechariah was not willing to stand by silently, while Joash and the people sank back into the old traps of idolatry. With eyes full of determination, he stood up before the crowd and began to speak, and boy, did he mince words. There, in the middle of the temple that had so often echoed with praise, harsh and direct words now echoed. Zechariah fearlessly denounced the errors of Joash and the people, pointing out every deviation, every betrayal of the covenant with God. It was as if the walls of that sacred place trembled with the force of his voice. He did not beat around the bush. He did not sugarcoat the truth. And this, of course, deeply disturbed Joash, who was already so hardened that he recognized neither the value nor the courage of that warning. The most shocking thing, Joash, the same king who had once been saved and raised within that temple, the place where Zechariah now cried out for repentance, decided to silence the prophet's voice. And he did so in the worst possible way. He had Zechariah stoned right there in the temple courtyard. The blood of that righteous man stained the sacred ground and left an almost suffocating weight in the air, as if something terrible had been set in motion at that moment. And before he died, Zechariah uttered one last sentence, which echoed like thunder, "The Lord will see and call for an accounting." Zechariah's blood had barely dried on the floor of the temple when the first signs of punishment began to appear. From the lands of Syria, an army rose with a force that no one expected. The Arameans were not many in number, but they came with a fury that seemed driven by something much greater than simple territorial conquest. It was as if that troop had been sent not only to wage war, but to collect an old debt, the same one that Zechariah had announced with his last breath. Joash, who had previously seemed so secure on the throne, now found himself surrounded by fear. The kingdom, which until recently had been at peace, became a scene of destruction. Gates fell, houses were looted, and the people screamed in the streets, unable to understand how everything had collapsed so quickly. It was useless to have temples renovated on the outside if, on the inside, faith was crumbling. This became clearer than ever when, despite Judah's military strength, the Arameans won with ease. It was almost unbelievable, a small army defeating an entire kingdom. Joash was seriously wounded during the invasion, and the humiliation was evident. The king who had once been seen as a savior was now broken, physically and spiritually. And the people, who had followed every phase of his story, from hidden baby to courageous young man to king blinded by power, now saw with their own eyes the price of disobedience. But the tragedy was not over yet. Wounded and humiliated after the invasion, Joash took refuge in the silent corridors of the palace, trying to recover from both his physical pain and the invisible wound that had opened in his soul. But, ironically, the real danger no longer came from enemies outside. It came from within. There, within familiar walls, treacherous whispers began to emerge. His own officers, men he thought were loyal, were plotting in the shadows, tired of a king who had lost his touch and their respect. The atmosphere inside the palace was tense, almost suffocating. Guards exchanged nervous glances, and servants moved too quickly, as if they knew something was about to explode. Joash, weakened and perhaps already suspecting that something was wrong, no longer had the strength to contain the silent storm that was brewing. Until one night when everything seemed too quiet, the betrayal came to light. Two of his closest officers entered the room where Joash was resting and without hesitation killed him right there. There were no battle cries or the clang of swords in the open field. It was cold, quick, and almost without fanfare, a death that mirrored the coldness Joash himself had shown earlier. And so, the king who began his life in hiding to escape death ended his days almost anonymously, betrayed by those he trusted most. His body was buried in the city of David, but a curious and meaningful detail, not in the tomb of the kings, as would have been expected. It was as if even history wanted to make it clear that this reign had begun full of promise, but ended in disappointment. After Joash's quiet death, the kingdom continued on its course, as if it wanted to quickly turn the page on a history so full of ups and downs. His body was placed in the tomb of the city of David, but not alongside the other kings, a gesture that, without words, spoke volumes about the legacy Joash left behind. The people, who had once cheered when they saw that boy crowned at only 7 years old, now carried a bitter mixture of memories, of broken hopes, fleeting glories, and painful falls. Joash's life seemed like a book with chapters marked by stark contrasts. He began as a symbol of a miracle, someone whom God had preserved against all odds. He grew up under the protection of Jehoiada, with everything going for him, and for a time he even shone, rebuilding the temple and rekindling the faith of the people. But in the end, what remained was the shadow of bad decisions, wrong alliances, and faith lost along the way. A reign that had everything to be unforgettable for its strength and fidelity ended up being remembered more for its failures and abandonment. But it is curious how, even after all this, the story of Joash never disappeared. It lived on, passing from generation to generation, whispering a truth that spans the centuries. It is not enough to start well. You must remain steadfast until the end. Joash shows us, without masks, how the right choices can take us to incredible places, but also how a heart that strays can ruin even the greatest achievements. And so, looking at this whole story that unfolded like a drama full of twists and turns, Joash's life stands before us like a mirror full of warning signs and also of hope. He teaches us that no matter how strong we start out, no matter how many miracles have put us on the right path, the real test is in the continuity, in the consistency of our choices day after day. Joash was saved when he didn't even have the strength to fight for himself, protected by courageous hands and guided with love and faith during his early years. Everything pointed to a brilliant reign, and for a while it really was. But time reveals who we really are, and when the winds change and the right voices fall silent, that's when character needs to stand on its own. Joash, without the steadfastness of Jehoiada at his side, ended up giving in to pressure and wrong influences, until he lost sight of everything he had once sworn to defend. And it is impossible not to see in this a direct warning to all of us. It is easy to stand firm when we are surrounded by good advisors, but the greatest challenge comes when we have to bear the weight of decisions alone. Looking back, the great lesson that Joash's life leaves us is as clear as day. Faith cannot be momentary, nor can it depend on circumstances. It needs to be cultivated, strengthened, and above all, lived with integrity from beginning to end. Joash had his victories, but he also left deep scars for himself and for the people who trusted him. And as new stories emerged in Judah, the memory of the king, who began as a hope and ended as a warning, continued to echo, like a soft voice saying, "Stand firm, not just at the beginning, but until your last breath." If you enjoyed the story of Joash and want to continue following other stories of faith and overcoming adversity, be sure to like this video and share it with your loved ones. And of course, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any new content. Together, we will explore more powerful lessons from the Bible.